Hello. So today I'm going to discuss the reading by Patricia Hill Collins about Black feminism, and it's from the textbook Theories of Race and Racism. So I will share my screen and my lecture slides, which I will post online on Moodle. So the lecture is called Black Feminism, Standpoint Epistemology, Intellectualism, and Humanity. And I'll start by discussing standpoint epistemology. Feminist standpoint theory is something that uh, was popularized by many feminist philosophers who argued against positivism. And Sandra Harding is one noteworthy example of a feminist scholar who um, created this term standpoint feminist theory to discuss the ways that centering the lived experiences of women and of other marginalized groups allows one to challenge a positivist vision of history, of reality, and of science itself, of uh, everyday life. The point is that positivism puts forward this idea that there is a universal experience. There is one truth. There is one interpretation of reality. And what standpoint feminists have argued is that reality seems very different depending upon one's positionality. So the ways that the criminal justice system works for Black women or does not work for Black women, the ways that one imagines police, the ways that capitalism works for people is not universal, as many privileged people would perhaps want one to believe. One standpoint really determines their experiences of institutions. How we even feel about state power and institutions really depends upon our standpoint. So some might think that the police are people who protect others and protect us as taxpayers or as citizens. But obviously, what the Black Lives Matter movement has demonstrated for many years is that the police are also people who scare many people, especially people of color and especially Black people in North America and throughout the global North. So Patricia Hill Collins discusses Black feminist standpoint theory as a set of ideas that center the lived experiences and positionality of Black women. And Hill Collins also discusses the ways that Black feminism has sometimes been a cisnormative set of ideas, specifically earlier writings by Black feminists. And many contemporary Black feminists also emphasize the importance of centering the lived experiences of Black trans people. The point is that rather than thinking about America as a country or as a geographical body that one would experience in the same way, irrespective of gender or race or class. Hill Collins' work, like many feminist theorists and anti-racist scholars and neo-Marxist scholars, centers the experiences of marginalized people and discusses the ways that a country looks very different depending upon who you are in it, where you live, how much capital you have access to. Um, Patricia Hill Collins' work is really impressive and offers a, I think, really admirable contribution to the fields of critical race theory and feminist theory. Uh, Her work, Black Feminist Thought, is one of the most well-cited texts regarding Black feminism in the world. Hill Collins attended Harvard University in 1970. She is a distinguished university professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park. And she's the former head of the Department of African American Studies at the University of Cincinnati. And she was elected president of the American Sociological Association and served in 2009. And she was the first African American woman to hold the position of president of the American Sociological Association. So her work is very well cited everywhere. And in this article, which is from your textbook, Patricia Hill Collins discusses the Combahee River Collective. And Hill Collins states the term Black feminist has also been used to describe selected African American women who possess some version of a feminist consciousness. This usage of the term yields the most restrictive notion of who can be a Black feminist. The groundbreaking Combahee River Collective document, a Black feminist statement, implicitly relies on this definition. The collective claims that, quote, as Black women, we find any type of biological determinism a particularly dangerous and reactionary basis upon which to build a politic. But in spite of this statement, by implying that only African American women can be Black feminists, they require a biological prerequisite for race and gender consciousness. The collective also offers its own ideological criteria for identifying Black feminist ideas. In contrast to Beverly Guy Sheftall, the collective places a strong emphasis on capitalism as a source of Black women's oppression and on political activism as a distinguishing feature of Black feminism. So this is one of the tensions in a lot of identity-based movements. And it's a tension between opposition to capitalism and a desire for inclusion or success in capitalist terms for people of color. So there are those who would argue that capitalism is the root cause of marginalized people's oppression. And this class is at a Canadian university, and Canada is a settler colony that has actively discriminated against and dispossessed many Indigenous peoples of their lands. And so one could argue that it is capitalism that has created a context in which there are thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls who are often murdered in extremely sadistic ways. There are, however, those who would argue that the problem with capitalism is that it is unequal or does not work fairly, and that people of color, including Indigenous people, that Black, Indigenous, and people of color should strive for economic achievement in order to improve one's quality of living. So the Combahee Collective then placed a strong emphasis on anti-capitalism, and rather than just looking at Black women, the collective looked at the ways that capitalism appears in America from the vantage point of working class and poor Black women. This tension between then wanting to improve one's condition within capitalism as opposed to offering a critique of capitalism itself is something that many feminist theorists and anti-racist theorists have discussed in their work. Biological determinism, as opposed to or in relation to strategic essentialism, is also a tension that we have discussed from the first lecture in this class about race, which is placed in quotes in the syllabus, and racism, which is not placed in quotes. So the use of the quotations around the term race is a way of acknowledging that race is a social construct. And this is something that the Combahee River Collective also discussed, that they did not want to restrict participation and activism or speech or creative expression because of biological determinism. At the same time, the collective also wanted to acknowledge that irrespective of one's understanding of identity as being socially constructed, identity is often policed and put under surveillance and used to establish hierarchy. So the same would be true of our understanding of gender and sexuality in this time period. Judith Butler's writings regarding performativity are really foundational in gender studies, and we can often accept in the liberal arts and humanities, and specifically in sociology and anthropology, that gender is constructed. However, everyday experiences that people have are often still quite gendered, and sexism and heterosexism and rape culture, transphobia are obviously all experiences that are gendered experiences that one has, and often involves a violation of legal rights. So I'll play some of the clips, but I will post the slides so when you have more time, you can look at all of the clips. But in the interest of time, I will just play some of the recorded clips. So this is a clip about Black feminism.
Then that we have that ability. And so we need the how.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As President Trump completes his first year in office, activists in cities across the country will hold mass protests Saturday on the first anniversary of the historic Women's March. We're speaking with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and now editor of a new collection of essays titled How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. Now, this is a collective that formed 40 years ago, but certainly has had a significant impact on activism today. And we're going to go back in time and learn a little about what that is. Again, Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, our guest in part 2 of this discussion. Combahee River Collective, why was it called that? And who were these women?
So the Combahee Collective named themselves after a raid that was led and conducted by Harriet Tubman in 1853 in South Carolina along the Combahee River that freed several hundred slaves. And that really was, they wanted to name themselves after a political act, which I think is very important to their politics, which is identifying clearly the ways that Black women are oppressed. And I think that that is a important contribution that the Combahee River Collective makes. The discussion about interlocking oppressions, how the way that Black women experience oppression in our society cannot just be factored through the lens of race. It cannot just be factored through the lens of sexism or gender oppression. But we look at how those factors together create even new ways of understanding oppression. And so they talked about interlocking oppressions. They talked about they coined the term identity politics, which has come to mean all sorts of things 40 years after its entry into our political lexicon. But for them, identity politics were quite simple. It was a way of understanding how African American came to understand their oppression in society. It was a way to really locate the source of Black women's politicization and even radicalization, that their experiences with sexism and racism at home, at school, at work, at the doctor's office is really what shaped their political and social experiences in the world. And that became the basis upon which Black women were going to become active in politics. And so they connected these different kinds of political insights and analyses into also a theory of how to confront them, how to combat them. And so one aspect of that was linking this oppression to capitalism, which I think is a critical intervention, but also to connecting it to the oppression of other people. And so they called specifically for coalition politics. And then once strategies had been identified, they recognized that it was important, critical to link women's liberation, Black women's liberation, to a complete reconceptualization of American society, and in fact, a reorganization of American society. And so these are not just interesting historical anecdotes, they're not just interesting historical lessons, but they speak very clearly to the contemporary crisis that we find ourselves in, and not just for Black women, but really for the oppressed and the exploited in this country and internationally. That these are the politics of solidarity, the politics of struggle, and really should be integrated into our discussions about what we do to get free.
Talk about the women involved.
So I interviewed the three authors, the co-authors of the statement: Barbara Smith, her twin sister Beverly Smith, and Demita Frazier. And so they were Black women who had been politically active, who had come of age politically during the early 1960s, had all, I think, graduated high school in 1967, 1968. Barbara Smith talks quite fondly of her going to Chicago in 1968 for the Democratic Party National Convention and participating in the protests there. Demita Frazier talks quite poignantly about her experiences in the Black Panther Party in Chicago and how that was formative in her the development of her politics. Beverly Smith talks about an earlier iteration of political activism in Cleveland involving the Congress of Racial Equality and the struggle around educational justice and her and Barbara's involvement in organizing freedom schools. And so
and didn't Barbara also help to found the Kitchen Table Women of Color Press?
Yeah, absolutely. Which was it came later. It came in the 1980s, but created a critical space for the publication of Black women's writing and became instrumental. Yeah, and became instrumental in the development of not just Black women's studies, but of women's studies as an academic discipline. The role of Kitchen Press in that was quite foundational.
Also, Charlene McRae, the First Lady of New York,
Yes.
who is married to Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, was one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective.
So I found that out recently, which is fascinating to me. But I think that it points to, in some ways, the development of perhaps a relatively new dynamic in Black women's politics. And so in my first book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, I talk extensively about the shift in the Black movement from a kind of radical street movement to organized politics, to formal politics, what Bayard Rustin has described as the movement from protest to politics. And, you know, some people look at that transition favorably. And I don't look at it as favorably or unfavorably. I look at it to examine what dynamics are uncovered in that transition from protest to, I wouldn't say to politics, but to formal politics, really to the Democratic Party. And it highlighted the shifts in class dynamics within the Black community that for many decades after the Civil Rights Movement was really understood mainly through the rise of Black men elected officials. But I think in the last 20 to 25 years, we've seen Black women not to the same degree, to a lesser degree, but to a significant and very visible degree, the shift in class dynamics amongst Black women, where you have the emergence of a Black woman elite and a Black woman's political class. Which I would say McRae is certainly a part of that, even though she is the wife of Bill de Blasio, that she plays a political role in the city of New York. And so it raises the question about class tensions, class dynamics between Black women, and does that change the objectives within whatever we would term as the Black feminist movement today? If at the heart of Black feminist politics has really been a political agenda shaped by the experiences of poor and working class women around reproductive freedom, around campaigns for higher wages, for healthcare, that really orient on the role of Black women as care providers in households that suffer disproportionately from poverty, then what does that say about the role of women who are in positions to make powerful decisions, who have authority over the lives of Black working class women? I think it complicates the idea that by simply being Black women alone, that we are all on the same side or that we are all on the same team. And the issue of class is something that is very palatable in the Combahee River collective statement. And I think that, again, is the framework of that statement helps us in that regard make sense of even the contemporary issues dealing with class as it pertains to Black women in the Black community.
What is your assessment of the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, women speaking for themselves, speaking up?
I think it's very powerful, and the impact has been very powerful. And that in some ways, I think we're at the very beginning of what this has opened up. That right now has been largely contained to the internet, and has really been waged on an ideological basis. But I think the space, the urgency, and the need for it to manifest itself in terms of protest, demonstrations, and more long-lasting organizational forms is there, and that it needs to be taken advantage of. But I think perhaps probably one of the most important aspects of Me Too is how it has really exposed the lie of women's equality in American society, that we have constantly, been told that the women's movement go too far, women asking for too much. Doesn't the ascendancy of Hillary Clinton's campaign as the Democratic nominee signify a different position for women in this society? And I think you can say, yes, perhaps for some women, but for even those women, the quotidian levels of harassment, of assault, what some activists term rape culture in the United States is pervasive. And that is something that has to be identified, not just in a separate sphere of these experiences that women happen to have, but it really has to be linked to the ways that women are paid less, the ways that women's ability to accumulate the assets that are needed to navigate American society are minimized, because often these campaigns of harassment, this pervasive kind of sexism is happening at the workplace. And I think that is one of the most significant things that Me Too has exposed, is the conditions of sexism and abuse that women endure at work, that is not just about one's personal comfort level, but really have to do with the ability to earn a living wage, to earn a living salary.
So I'll stop it there in the interest of time. The Combahee River Collective is a well-known group that was foundational in the building of a Black feminist intellectual and activist tradition. And it is a collective whose writings are still cited in this time period by academics and activists. And the issue of class is something that is still fiercely debated, particularly among critical race scholars, and among other scholars who discuss identity politics. And there are those who have written extensively about queer capitalism and about Dalit capitalism, and also about economic advancement of people of color within institutions like banking and business as being the only means through which anti-racism could be actualized. There are scholars who are adamant that capitalism is actually a remedy for the suffering of people of color and colonized people. There are obviously also many scholars who follow from the tradition of the Combahee River Collective, who discuss the ways that capitalism has historically structured the alienation of Black people from the time of slavery onwards, and has specifically alienated Black women from all forms of social belonging, emotional care, sexual rights, reproductive rights, and human rights. So, Black feminist standpoint epistemology is something that Hill Collins discusses. And I think the class issue is something that is still unresolved in a lot of politics and writing. I mean, in terms of actual activism, and in in the discipline of sociology itself, one's attitudes towards capitalism, one's belief in the functioning of capitalism, is, I guess, determined by their interpretation of certain texts, and their use of certain statistics. So someone could make the argument, drawing from a Marxist perspective, that capitalism is an extremely unequal system and that no person who is not the most affluent person in any society will really ever experience anything but alienation, and exploitation. There are others who might draw upon other theorists who are not part of the Marxist tradition to argue that capitalism does work and that it can be a system that works fairly, with the use of the law or the state to uphold very basic ideas of fairness. I would argue from a Marxist perspective that class antagonism will always determine the kinds of relationships that people have, to the point that labor exploitation and alienation will affect every aspect of someone's life, including mental health, friendships, romantic relationships, child rearing. So I think that capitalism is not a system that could ever work fairly, unless there was some sort of political mobilization of the most marginalized people in any society. So Hill Collins argues that all African American women, and she also uses the term Black women in the article, experience oppression. And Hill Collins argues that all African American women share the common experience of being Black women in a society that denigrates women of African descent. This commonality of experience suggests that certain characteristic themes will be prominent in a Black woman's standpoint. For example, one core theme is a legacy of struggle. Katie Cannon observes, throughout the history of the United States, the interrelationship of white supremacy and male superiority has characterized the Black woman's reality as a situation of struggle, a struggle to survive in two contradictory worlds, simultaneously one white, privileged and oppressive, the other Black, exploited and oppressed. So this idea of two worlds is something that Black feminist scholars and anti-racist scholars often write about, and many people have written extensively about the differences between Black America and white America. Black women's vulnerability to assaults in the workplace, on the street, and at home has stimulated Black women's independence and self-reliance. In spite of differences created by historical era, age, age, social class, sexual orientation, or ethnicity, the legacy of struggle against racism and sexism is a common thread binding African American women. Anna Julia Cooper, a 19th century Black woman intellectual, describes Black women's vulnerability to sexual violence. I would beg to add my plea for the colored girls of the South, that large, bright, promising, fatally beautiful class, so full of promise and possibilities, yet so sure of destruction, often without a father to whom they dare apply the loving term, often without a stronger brother to espouse their cause and defend their honor with his life's blood, in the midst of pitfalls and snares, waylaid by the lower classes of white men with no shelter, no protection. So this kind of experience of oppression often involves the constant scrutinization of Black women. And I mean, the idea, I guess, from the perspective of, say, someone who does not believe in oppression, is that people who are oppressed are responsible for their alienation. And so when someone is sexist or racist, they constantly scrutinize the bodies and appearance and behavior and work of women and of people of color, and they somehow imagine that white men are not responsible for anything or anyone. And so there's often no scrutiny, even on an everyday basis, of white male behavior towards anyone. Patricia Collins also writes about controlling images, and one of the things that one can observe when you're kind of around like an average group of people who've been exposed to North American media is how much they really want to say something about women's appearances or people of color's appearances or behavior at all times. But white men are often these unmarked subjects who can do whatever they want or say whatever they want and behave in whatever they want, spend money in whatever way they want to. And this is really how privilege operates. So Peggy Phelan has written extensively about art and performance. And Peggy Phelan wrote a book called Unmarked: The Politics of Performance, which is a really interesting book about performance. And what Phelan argues is that there is no more powerful position in the world than the unmarked position. So this kind of constant scrutiny is something that is really annoying when you talk to people who are simultaneously oppressed with, simultaneously sort of obsessed with kind of social justice, while also being really critical of women and people of color. And it doesn't really make any sense. Like the Occupy Wall Street movement did make sense. It was about questioning class relations, which often mean that the entire wealth of a country is controlled by a very small percentage of people, many of whom are cisgender, heterosexual white men. But what doesn't often make sense in a lot of this kind of social movement activism, or even in terms of people who are interested in feminism, is that they often scrutinize the work and the behavior of women who are part of the feminist movement or people of color to a greater degree than they scrutinize those who are in positions of institutional authority. So it is, I think, important to think about always rooting one's analysis in a Marxist perspective, which would question the ideology of the ruling class and the behavior of the ruling class, rather than questioning the behavior of the working class or the proletariat. So a premise of standpoint theory is that people in certain groups who share experiences based on their location in a hierarchical social order will encounter similar constraints and opportunities. Long-standing institutional power relations which oppress these groups will engender knowledge born of shared experiences. Empirical research supports common perspectives among Black women and often Black men in the United States regarding impacts of many shared anti-Black, dehumanizing, at times life-threatening experiences. So I guess it is interesting to think about capitalism again, and I am someone who's studied in the Marxist and neo-Marxist tradition. So no, I don't think that I don't know, um, obtaining the most money possible and most suburban property possible, or the most investments possible in the North American economy would really be a liberatory thing to do. The model minority syndrome is something that Asian and South Asian Americans have written about extensively. Particularly feminists have argued that Asian and South Asian women are often called upon to be good women, and often juxtaposed to these really pathological images of white working class women and Black women. And this kind of model minority who has no desire whatsoever, and has no sense of entitlement to even speech, is something that upholds North American capitalism, and labor exploitation. So I think that work is obviously something that people do for money, and they can only do so much work without it being exploitative, because one is only paid so much for their time, which is why we have labor unions. The problem is that the neoliberalization of feminism has created brand identity as a form of work. And Lola Olufemi is a Black British feminist who has written a great book called Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. And Olufemi discusses white feminism as an outgrowth of capitalism. And what white feminism often involves is this kind of seamless production of a brand identity with activism. And Olufemi argues that the problem with this kind of construction of a capitalist identity as activism is obviously that people are not brands. They are only being paid for a certain amount of hours. So expecting someone to kind of be a mother and a model and an activist and a healthcare provider, all of these things are really expectations that were placed on women in previous generations before the suffragette movement. People have a right to vote, and they obviously have a right to vote for labor unions. So Black feminist thought is a collection of ideas, writing, and art that articulates a standpoint of and for Black women of the African diaspora. Black feminist thought describes Black women as a unique group that exists in a place in U.S. social relations where intersectional processes of race, ethnicity, gender, class, and sexual orientation shape Black women's individual and collective consciousness, self-definitions, and actions. As a standpoint theory, Black feminist thought conceptualizes identities as organic, fluid, interdependent, multiple, and dynamic, socially constructed locations within historical context. Black feminist thought is grounded in Black women's historical experience with enslavement, anti-lynching movements, segregation, civil rights, and Black power movements, sexual politics, capitalism, and patriarchy. So feminist standpoint theories, which originated in the standpoint of women, have been revised as it became apparent that the constitution of the subject woman is the result of a complex interplay of individual and large-scale social forces. So feminist standpoint theory has been used by many different feminists, including Dalit feminists in India, who draw on the writings of feminist theorists like Patricia Hill Collins to discuss the ways that Indian society appears from the perspective of Dalit women. And Sharmila Regge wrote extensively about the lived experiences and the labor experiences of Dalit women, and OBC, other backward caste women in India. And this use of standpoint theory was used to discuss collective positionality rather than individual experience. And it was specifically important because of the ways that caste often determines class and structures social relations, including friendships and marital relations in India and in the Indian diaspora. So Sharmila Regge quotes Weeks, who states that a standpoint is a project, not an inheritance. It is achieved, not given. So people who are part of the Indian diaspora may not have been told a great deal about their caste or class position. And if they are, they might have not been told about their caste or class position in a way that is honest about the brutalities of caste. So standpoint is not just an inheritance that is given by one's parents. It is achieved through work, which involves understanding one's position within global capitalism critically.
We're traveling.
So this is a clip about Sandra Harding discussing standpoint theory's history and controversial reception. One of the reasons I would argue that anti-racist feminism does not kind of become mainstream or is not taken seriously is because of inheritance and inheritance of familial wealth over generations. People who are part of the South Asian diaspora do inherit wealth that is often wealth garnered because of the caste system and because of human slavery in South Asia. And I think that people often refuse to tell the truth about things like caste-based discrimination over generations. One can identify as a person of color, but this does not mean that one is not implicated in the caste system in South Asia or in a class structure which is extremely unequal in Asia and in other parts of the global South, like Latin America.
Rico with the adventures looks like in 45 seconds. You'll wander beneath misty.
Sometimes there are even like comedians, and there's a lot of desi media that focuses on the Indian diaspora that is supposed to be funny, but I would argue that it is only funny if you ignore the caste system and, yes, human slavery.
What high
question, the great insights.
From a feminist perspective, if one does take the caste system seriously, then what one might argue is that rape is central to the ways that South Asian societies, and yes, Indian societies in India and the Indian diaspora organize their lives, that upper caste Hindu men often have the entitlement to organize their lives by selecting women who I would argue do not ever have the legal right to consent or do not ever have enough financial capital or education to say no to certain relationships that determine the lives of women in India and the diaspora over generations.
I was supposed to die in 2006. I had end-stage cancer. I went into a
Question, the great.
So this is a clip of Sandra Harding discussing standpoint epistemology.
Sandra Harding. I recently retired a year ago from UCLA, where I have for 20 years been in the graduate department of education and with a joint appointment in women's studies. I got my doctorate in philosophy at UCLA in 1973. And before I came to UCLA, I taught for 20 years at the University of Delaware. So what drew me to feminist theory in the first place? Well, when I started back to graduate school in 1968, I went to graduate school late. I had been out for 12 years working in New York City. When I returned to graduate school, very shortly after that, the women's movement started up. And my friends, graduate student friends who were working in ethics and in political philosophy were busy writing away about women's rights and abortion rights and a different understanding of democracy and women's need to be in important positions in the government. What was somebody thinking epistemology and philosophy of science supposed to do? Those of us who worked in science and knowledge epistemology areas were really quite puzzled how to use the terrific energy and resources the women's movement was providing to think philosophy in a different way. What happened was that in the social sciences and some areas of natural sciences, especially biology with women's health issues and environmental issues, questions about the objectivity, about the standard notion of objectivity as requiring value neutrality came under fire, right? How could it be that these supposedly value neutral sociologies, medical theories and so forth, that clearly were directed by the needs and interests of pharmaceutical companies, of physicians as opposed to their patients, of the welfare department instead of the people who were receiving welfare, of the World Bank instead of the people who needed the resources for development? How could it be that this was value neutral? It clearly wasn't. And so we started putting together, talking to people in the other disciplines that had these epistemological and philosophy of science concerns. So in my case, we would put together panels at AAAS or American Philosophical Association or the American Political Science Association. And we'd have on the panel, it would be me from philosophy and Nancy Hartzog from political theory and Ruth Hubbard from biology and somebody else from sociology. And we do parallel play. If any of you have had a 2-year-old, if you've been near a 2-year-old, you know what I mean by parallel play. The two little kids sit in a sandbox and they look at each other and they play completely separately. One builds a sandcastle, the other builds a sandcastle. They look at each other, it's parallel play. And that's what we did on the platform at these conferences. We each talk about the lack of objectivity, of the presence of all kinds of white elite male class and race values that were shaping what counted as research, what counted as good research. And we slowly began to develop a series of questions about the natural sciences and the social sciences that took on the conceptual apparatus of those fields. As the sociologist of knowledge, Dorothy Smith, put the point, in modern bureaucratic societies like ours, ruling is often largely a matter of manipulating concepts, right? What counts as a citizen, right? How should we conceptualize a citizen, right? How should we conceptualize a legitimate resident of this country, right? How should we conceptualize women's rights to control our own bodies, and so forth? How do I define feminism? Well, I think of feminism in the plural, feminisms. There are different feminisms. for different groups of women and men in different places in history and around the world. They're very different from each other, but what they share is a concern to provide resources so that for women to be able to take greater control of our lives. So what is this article about? Well, first of all, I have to note an odd thing about standpoint theory, and that is that it has remained extremely controversial. People object to it all the time on all kinds of grounds. And this is, nevertheless, it's now 40 years old. It's been this supposedly inadequate theory has persisted for 4 decades. That tells you that there's something going on here that needs a little more thought. Let me point out first that standpoint theory is thought of in a number of different ways. It's thought of as an epistemology, that is a theory of who can produce reliable knowledge and how knowledge should be justified. It's thought of as a philosophy of science, of how to, what best practices and goals for scientific research should be. It's thought of as a sociology of science that looks at the particular social conditions that create different kinds of knowledge and so forth. So it's sort of as a methodology, of course, of how to go about doing research. But standpoint theory is usually thought of as having a very particular historical lineage, and it does. Marx asked the question, what can we learn about how the class system works by starting off from workers' lives, rather than starting off from the lives of the elites of the day. And 100 and something years later, feminists picked this up and transformed it. It does have a source in 19th century and earlier European philosophy, but the feminist standpoint was specifically developed, as I indicated earlier, as a result of the research being done out of the politics of the women's movement, right, by sociologists, political scientists, and so forth. However, so that's the official intellectual lineage of standpoint theory, but standpoint approaches appear to be organic in this sense. Every time a new group steps on the stage of history, it tends to say something like, gee whiz, from the perspective of our lives, things look different. So you can see the civil rights movement saying that, you can see the poor people's movements, you can see post-colonial and decolonial movements saying that, lesbian, gay, bi, trans. So standpoint methodology and theory is a kind of organic logic of research, I would say. In the article, I talk about 3 sites of controversy in standpoint theory. The first one is that it extends the logic of scientific research, the control of the scientific research process, back, one could say, to the beginning of the research process, that is, the context of discovery. And for philosophers, and indeed many scientists, most scientists perhaps, the context of discovery was supposed to be left free of all kinds of regulatory controls. There's lots of talk in philosophy of science and in science of these serendipitous, accidental discoveries that were made, who knew they were going to ask this question, the great insights, completely inexplicable, of brilliant scientists. As Hilary Rose and Stephen Rose put the point, This way of doing philosophy of science makes science a humanity. It turns science into the kind of enterprise that is conducted by great artists and great poets and great musicians. They get insights from who knows where and go on. It's their individual creativity, their connection with the universe in some mystical, inexplicable way that permits the production of important new knowledge. Now, there certainly is something right about that, but in fact, the origins of scientific questions has another very clear dimension, namely, whatever the funders and sponsors want funded and sponsored gets turned into scientific questions. And the kinds of research questions that women or racial minorities or poor people might want asked do not get asked. For example, how there's a whole field of neglected tropical diseases, right? Which are ones that don't interest. They don't strike rich people, they strike poor people living in jungles and so forth. So why bother to figure out how to resolve them? And there's many other questions, of course, that all of these new social justice movements of the 1960s raised that had not gotten to the beginning of the official research process. So standpoint theory says that who gets to decide what counts as a scientific question is a very important part of the research process. And we social justice movement people want different questions asked than those that have been asked only by pharmaceutical companies, by militaries, by national governments trying to control their population, their prisons, and so forth. So that's one side of controversy. And it should be, I'm arguing, controversial. We need to talk about how come science is directed and managed only or primarily by corporations, states, and militaries. That's an important question. What should be is that what the relationship between science and society should be? Is everything we want to know going to be produced by sciences that respond only to the concerns of those groups? So that's the first side of controversiality that I think is important. Now, a second source of controversy for standpoint theory is that it seems to be making the knowers, not individuals primarily, but social groups. And that goes against our whole Enlightenment 500-year, or however you want to date it, 400, 300-year tradition of modernity. It's individuals who are agents of knowledge and of political action. And yet standpoint theory seems to be saying it's groups of people. It's women, it's poor people, it's Latinas, it's disabled people. These groups of people are the subjects or agents of knowledge. And so that should be controversial. There should be, good defenses of both sides of that question. But certainly I'm interested to defend the counter dominant view that in fact, what people do both enables and limits what they can know. We all have maps of our cities, but if you travel the city on a motorcycle or a car, or go through it on a train, or fly over it, or walk it, or bike it, or push a baby carriage, or a walker around it, you'll have a very different map of the city in each case. You'll know different things about how to get from here to there, according to how you are able to interact with your environment as you travel. So the fact that different groups gain different kinds of knowledge, of course, each person's knowledge is individual. each of us individually knows things that nobody else knows, yet we share certain kinds of experiences because of the kinds of obligations and duties and opportunities created in our lives. Not everybody takes care of small children, the elderly, and the sick. People who do that will have certain kinds of knowledge, not only of small children, the elderly, and the sick, but of the dominant social institutions that are supposed to be providing resources or not for those groups. So the second point of controversiality here is to understand that knowledge is always a social product, as well as something produced by particular individuals. They're always located in certain historical moments, certain geographical places, certain cultures, and certain ways in which those cultures and geographies and histories interact. So knowledge is both individually produced and produced through group experiences. So the third source of controversiality I want to talk about, there are others, but the third one that the article talks about is the fact that standpoint theory seems to be doing social constructivism. That is, it's arguing that knowledge is socially constructed. But standpoint theory has a different kind of constructivism. As I indicated, it argues that how we interact with natural and social environments both enables and limits what we can know. It doesn't determine what we can know, and nevertheless, it's relevant to what we can know. It provides certain opportunities for us to think in kinds of ways we might not have otherwise thought. So what do I want readers to take away from this article, the most important point? I think it's that we should always ask whose knowledge is being produced, for whom is a particular piece of research going to provide benefits, and who's going to bear the costs of that being the question pursued rather than others that might be important. Do I want to give advice to young people today? No way. I have no idea what the world you're living in now, let alone the one you're going to be living in, is about. And you will find your own ways to ask the kinds of questions that are important for you to ask. Go for it.
So that is a clip about standpoint epistemology. And Hill Collins discusses the ways that queer people of color's critique of early Black feminism is important to consider in relation to standpoint epistemology. That's the argument that Black feminist thought, as the text makes, is that there is a shared commonality of oppression among Black women. And Hill Collins argues that this is true. However, sexuality is an experience that is a key factor in determining power relations throughout the course of people's lives, particularly in relation to family members, and one's relationship to family members also determine their access to financial support and housing security from family members. So Hill Collins writes that sexual orientation provides another key factor. Black lesbians have identified homophobia in general and the issues they face living as Black lesbians in homophobic communities as being a major influence on their angle of vision on everyday events. Beverly Smith describes how being a lesbian affected her perceptions of the wedding of one of her closest friends. God, I wish I had one friend here, someone who knew me and would understand how I feel. I am masquerading as a nice, straight, middle-class black girl. While the majority of those attending the wedding saw only a festive event, Beverly Smith felt that her friend was being sent into a form of bondage. So the experience of the family, I think, looks very different from the standpoint of queer people of color and from the standpoint of Black, transgender, queer, and lesbians, or Black, transgender people, queer people, and Black lesbians. So in much of the writing from certain time periods from Black feminists, the family was seen as a refuge from labor exploitation and from racism. And the Black family was seen as a unit of care. And a lot of the problems that were written about were not about the institution of the family, but were about problems that Black working class people had in terms of having time to spend with their family, or in terms of men not taking an active role in child rearing or parenting. However, the institution of the cisgender heterosexual family itself was often not critiqued. And this is something that queer people of color's criticism and writing, and specifically Black, transgender, and queer people and Black lesbians have been really clear about, like the family itself as an institution that upholds cisnormativity, heteronormativity, and Christian family values, is often obviously not innocent. And Marx and Engels wrote extensively about the ways that the family has always been central to class antagonism between women and men, that what Marx and Engels writes about in certain essays is the way that the family is actually introduced as this bourgeois ideal around the time when women become competitive with men in the workforce and in education. So natalism as a philosophy, this obsession with having one's own children and with women giving birth to children, actually is a central feature of class antagonism, that when women start to earn the same amount of money as men, or when they have the same amount of education and cannot be denied work because they can do things like fix a human heart or collect statistics, then the family and childbirth become central to the ways that the gender pay equity gap continues to be very large, that women will consistently still make less than men and will still be called upon to fulfill certain gendered and domestic roles that are often seen to have more importance than work or one's individual financial earnings. And this is particularly true, I think, of Black women, and the ways that the family and an emphasis on childbirth and child rearing can put Black women at a further disadvantage economically and in the education system. So many Black lesbians have written about the ways that social control in the family, control over sexuality, over appearance, over even speech, has been really deadening for many people who would not think of the family as being a great thing. Statistics about child abuse, including child sexual abuse, rape, and domestic violence, have always been central to the feminist movement. And so one of the tensions I think that exists within Black feminist theory has been this romanticization of the family and the cisgender heterosexual family as this kind of refuge from what is imagined to be the policing or racism of mainstream white society. The problem is that domestic violence, child abuse, rape of children, especially female children, and other forms of intimate partner violence obviously mean that the family is not a safe space for many people, and specifically for many women of color. If one was to think about even the family and the treatment of women in transnational terms, then high rates of the killing of women in India and Pakistan, in Latin America and the Caribbean obviously impact the ways that people of color in North America understand the lives of women and girls and of patriarchal power over generations. So Patricia Hill Collins then discusses the struggle for self-definition as being an important feature of Black feminism. And what Hill Collins argues is that oppressed people are often defined by others. And so a central philosophical I guess, philosophical tenet of Black feminism and Black feminist theory has been the importance of self-definition. And so Hill Collins writes that an oppressed group's experiences may put its members in a position to see things differently, but their lack of control over the ideological apparatuses of society makes expressing a self-defined standpoint more difficult. So in the interest of time, I'll finish by discussing controlling images. Controlling images are an interesting aspect of Hill Collins' discussion in her book, Black Feminist Thought. And Patricia Hill Collins discusses the ways that intersecting oppressions could not continue without powerful ideological justifications for their existence. So, as Cheryl Gilkes contends, Black women's assertiveness and their use of every expression of racism to launch multiple assaults against the entire fabric of inequality have been consistent, multifaceted threats to the status quo. So this kind of inequality is also about the family. Like obviously people fall in love and they're happy to have a family, but the idea of the image of the family is being more important than the experience of, say, violence or domestic violence is something that I think makes no rational sense and should be questioned by people who believe in fairness and the rule of law, that just having a family or having a romantic relationship with someone as a form of kind of saving face for others or telling others that one has a family is, I think, really dangerous. One of the reasons that I think domestic violence and intimate partner violence, sexual abuse of children, and physical abuse of children continues is because people are obsessed with this idea of the image of normalcy, irrespective of whether or not they actually experience normalcy. The same would be true of work. Saying that one has a job or a title is fine, but in the time of the internet, many people are not going to remember what you have told them anyway. So if one has an experience of work that involves extreme exploitation to the point that they have mental health issues or dietary issues or issues with sleep apnea, then it perhaps is not important, I think, to participate in an institution or to have a title, like in the same way that having a title as like husband or wife or a title as a professor is just language. It isn't the experience of the mind or body on an everyday basis. So Hill Collins argues that Black women have been assaulted with a variety of negative images, portraying African American women as stereotypical mammies, matriarchs, welfare recipients, and hot mamas helps justify U.S. Black women's oppression. As part of a generalized ideology of domination, stereotypical images of Black womanhood take on special meaning. Because the authority to define societal values is a major instrument of power, elite groups in exercising power and manipulative ideas about Black womanhood. They do so by exploiting already existing symbols or creating new ones. Hazel Carby suggests that the objective of stereotypes is not to reflect or represent a reality, but to function as a disguise or mystification of objective social relations. These controlling images are designed to make racism, sexism, poverty, and other forms of social injustice appear to be natural, normal, and inevitable parts of everyday life. And so Hill Collins argues that self-definition is extremely important in the context of the history of US image production, which has often involved these really cartoonish and offensive and insulting portrayals of Black women. An oppressed group's experiences may put its members in a position to see things differently, but their lack of control over the ideological apparatuses of society makes expressing a self-defined standpoint more difficult. Elderly domestic worker. Oh, I already said this, sorry. So finally, I'll finish by discussing Black feminist intellectuals. And there are more video clips, but in the interest of time, I won't play all of the clips. But if you're interested, when I post the slides, you can watch the clips on your own. If you think that this topic is of interest and you would like to explore it further in your final assignment or your presentation. So finally, Hill Collins discusses the importance of Black feminist intellectuals and knowledge production. So Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak is someone whose work we will discuss in a later lecture, or I will discuss in a later lecture. And Spivak has written an essay called Can the Subaltern Speak, which is a very well-cited Marxist essay and also a well-cited Marxist post-colonial feminist essay. And Spivak discusses epistemic violence, and epistemic violence refers to the violence of knowledge production. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. It is how we know things, and refusing to accept that certain people produce knowledge is a form of epistemic violence. So refusing to acknowledge any forms of knowledge that were produced by people who are not white or English speaking or not from the global north is a form of epistemic violence. And the refusal to acknowledge Black women's contribution to academic scholarship, to artistic production, to creative production, and to the writing of books in the English language, specifically in the Americas, is a really obscene form of epistemic violence. Not allowing one to read and write was a central facet of slavery, and not allowing Black women to read and write was a specific aspect of slavery that went on and on. And the refusal to allow Black women to read or write, or to acknowledge the writing of Black women is a kind of really obvious and I think vulgar expression of anti-Black racism against women or misogynoir. So Hill Collins states that Black women intellectuals provide unique leadership for Black women's empowerment and resistance. In discussing Black women's involvement in the feminist movement, Sheila Radford Hill points out the connections among self-definition, empowerment, and taking action in one's own behalf. Black women now realize that part of the problem within the movement was our insistence that white women do for with us what we must do for with ourselves, namely frame our own social action around our own agenda for change. Critical to this discussion is the right to organize on one's own behalf. Black feminist thought cannot challenge race, gender, and class oppression without empowering African American women. Oppressed people resist by identifying themselves as subjects, by defying their reality, shaping their new identity, naming their history, telling their story, notes bell hooks. Because self-definition is key to individual and group empowerment, using an epistemology that cedes the power of self-definition to other groups, no matter how well-meaning, in essence perpetuates Black women's subordination. As Black feminist sociologist Deborah K. King succinctly states, Black feminism asserts self-determination as essential. Black women intellectuals are central in the production of Black feminist thought because we alone can create the group autonomy that must precede effective coalitions with other groups. The idea of autonomy and freedom of thought and freedom of mobility, I think, are central to Black feminism because of the history of slavery, also because of the history of forced religious indoctrination of people of color and specifically women of color throughout the world. Women of color have the right to think and to read whatever texts we want to, and we also have the right to use our bodies in whatever ways we want to. This autonomy is quite distinct from separatist positions whereby Black women withdraw from other groups and engage in exclusionary politics. And these exclusionary politics can also involve forced religious indoctrination. So as I mentioned, I'll discuss Spivak in a later lecture, but for now I will talk about Spivak in relation to epistemic violence only. I will discuss the entirety of the essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, in a later lecture. So Gayatri Spivak writes, although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. So this idea of Europe as being an unmarked space, and the European, and specifically the kind of white European man as being every person, is the way that power conceals itself. And so Spivak argues that the critique of this kind of sovereign subject who has no origins and who can therefore speak on everyone's behalf and who can colonize everyone's land inaugurates this idea of a subject. So we only know that subject positions exist and that standpoints exist when we acknowledge that white men are not every person. I am not a white man, so obviously my position is a position, but it is not a position that will ever turn into something else. And this kind of turning into something else was central to the colonization of India. So Lord Macaulay was a central figure in the colonization of India, and Macaulay believed that educating people in India in English would turn Indian people into kind of mimic men or mimic people who would mimic the British and would eventually kind of keep trying throughout the course of their lives to be white and British. And so Spivak argues that this kind of erasure of the European is actually what creates the most powerful position in the world, which is a position of kind of supposed objectivity. So that if one does not acknowledge that they have a very specific vantage point, they don't also acknowledge their history of, say, the theft of other people's land, or the history of property ownership. So throughout the course of history in every global north country, women and people of color were excluded from owning property. So one's relationship to, say, property and wealth has obviously been historically determined, and it is not as though someone just became rich because they were great and others were not. So Spivak then discusses this term epistemic violence, and like many other terms created by women of color and by post-colonial scholars, but specifically women of color and queer people of color, other people have stolen this term epistemic violence and pretended that they created it. The same is true of the term feminist killjoy, which is Sarah Ahmed's term. The term does come from Gayatri Spivak. I mean, someone could just kind of pretend that other people's writing or work or artwork is theirs if they're kind of that cheap, but it is Gayatri Spivak's term. The clearest available example of such epistemic violence is the remotely orchestrated, far-flung, and heterogeneous project to constitute the colonial subject as other. This project is also the asymmetrical obliteration of the trace of that other in its precarious subjectivity. It is well known that Foucault locates epistemic violence, a complete overhaul of the episteme, in the redefinition of sanity at the end of the European 18th century. So Spivak then draws on Foucault in the same way that Judith Butler drew on Foucault to discuss performativity. And Spivak discusses colonial knowledge production as a form of epistemic violence. And so Spivak also discusses the ways that Black women historically were denied as knowers, and that their knowledge was consistently denied, and their knowledge was often denied in order to uphold structures of property ownership that justified slavery, and specifically also the rape of Black women. Sojourner Truth, speaking in 1867, highlighted the denial of Black women as knowers via asymmetries in cognitive authority and via men's habitually constrained imaginations. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, writing within a post-colonial context, identifies what she calls epistemic violence and claims to know the interests of subaltern persons that preclude the subaltern from formulating knowledge claims concerning their interests and speaking for themselves. These examples are part of a broader history of epistemic resistance through identifying and calling attention to ways in which knowers have been wronged in their capacities as knowers. So denying Black women the capacity to know is also about capital, that one can steal other people's writing and ideas and turn it into their own capital. And this has been done. The history of music is about stealing, the history of art, and the history of writing is also then obviously about theft. So finally, Hill Collins discusses womanism and humanism. So Black feminism as a body of scholarship is really interesting because it moves from the most particular position, which is the vantage point of the most oppressed, to the most general position, which is the vantage point of humanity. So what does, say, food security look like from the most marginalized people in the world? And then what do we have in common as human beings, which is kind of our capacity to stay alive and our necessity for things like food and water and shelter. And this is what Black feminism really offers us. Like if we were to think about the most oppressed people and what they lack, we then start to think about what is actually important to us as people and what we need to stay alive. So Alice Walker used this term womanist to discuss Black feminism as a tradition that is universal. By redefining all people as people of color, Walker universalizes what are typically seen as individual struggles, while simultaneously allowing space for autonomous movements of self-determination. So principles of love and fairness and humanity were always central to the Black feminist intellectual tradition. So Hill Collins writes, the words and actions of Black women intellectuals from different historical times and addressing markedly different audiences resonate with a strikingly similar theme of the oneness of all human life. Perhaps the most distinct version of the humanist vision in Black feminist thought is offered by Fannie Lou Hamer, the daughter of sharecroppers and a Mississippi civil rights activist. While sitting on her porch, Miss Hamer observed, "Ain't no such thing as I can hate anybody and hope to see God's face." So this idea of doing away with hatred in order to lead an ethical life, but also in order to do away with self-destructive thoughts in one's mind is also central to Black feminist thought historically. Taken together, the ideas of Anna Julia Cooper, Polly Murray, Bell Hooks, Alice Walker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and other Black women intellectuals, too numerous to mention, suggest a powerful answer to the question, what is Black feminism? Inherent in their words and deeds is a definition of Black feminism as a process of self-conscious struggle that empowers women and men to actualize a humanist vision of community. So the article then comes full circle from discussing the most particular position, the acute oppression of Black women as Black women and Black transgender and queer people as Black transgender and queer people in the history of the United States of America, to the most universal position of humanism. And I think that Hill Collins' ideas are really interesting in thinking about what the most marginalized people in the world lack, which is often food security, access to clean water, housing, and what we share as people. So this is also true of what the most marginalized people, I think, lack is environmental security and safety from really harsh effects of global climate change. And this is also, I think, what we as humanity can consider to be a really pressing issue in our time period. So if we think about what the most marginalized people are in need of, I think from a philosophical perspective, it allows one to think about what humanity really is and what people really need to survive. So I'll finish with this quote by Zora Neale Hurston. "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." So that's the lecture. I hope that you're enjoying the class. The next class, I will discuss Jose Munaz's article about queer people of color. And Munaz has written a book called Disidentifications, Queers of Color and the Politics of Resistance. So the first 4 lectures will be covered in the test. So the first 4 weeks of readings will be covered in the test, which I will post online on May 14th, and which is due on May 16th. That's all. Thank you very much. I hope you are all doing well. Thanks.